Chapter 1. A Tea Morning in Rosehill. The village of Rosehill had a way of waking slowly, as though it disliked being hurried into anything. Morning mist curled over the thatched roofs, softening the outline of cottages that had stood for 2 centuries. Beyond the hedgerows, orchards blushed with ripening apples, and somewhere a cockerel sounded his second, rather indignant crow. At the far end of the high street, the Bluebell tea room was already warm with the smell of baked scones and sweet jam. Mrs. Agatha Pym, its proprietor, was fussing with a tray of mismatched china, placing each cup at an exact angle before the arrival of the Thursday morning book circle. Thursdays were the only days she allowed chatter in her shop. The rest of the week she preferred a proper, contemplative silence. By 10 o'clock, a gentle parade of ladies had begun to arrive. Mrs. Heatherstone with her endless scarves, Miss Ellie Finch, earnest and easily flustered, and finally Miss Jane Marple, who came at an unhurried pace, knitting bags slung over her arm. She paused at the doorway, eyes sweeping the room with a calm curiosity that most mistook for frailty. She saw the crumbs already on the counter, the way Mrs. Pym's hands trembled ever so slightly, and the gleam of something bright caught beneath the rim of a delicate porcelain cup. "Good morning, Mrs. Pym," Miss Marple said, settling into her usual chair. "You've outdone yourself with the roses in the window. They make the whole place smell of summer." Before Mrs. Pym could reply, the door burst open. A breathless young man stumbled inside, Thomas Blake, the grocer's apprentice, face pale as curd. He clutched the doorframe and blurted, "Mrs. Pym, everyone. There's been an accident at the vicarage." Chairs scraped. Mrs. Heatherstone gave a shriek. Miss Marple's needles paused mid-click. "What sort of accident?" she asked gently. Blake swallowed. "It's Mr. Gerald Harcourt. They found him in the study. He's dead. And the inspector says it doesn't look natural." For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Only the ticking of the tea room's wall clock filled the silence. Mrs. Pym set down a cup too hard. It rang sharply against the saucer. Miss Marple's gaze drifted back to the porcelain teacup with the hidden gleam inside. A faint glint of deep blue, almost like a sapphire, lodged against the curve of china. She said nothing, but her eyes, clear and thoughtful, rested on it a moment longer than anyone noticed. Chapter 2. The shock spreads. Word of Gerald Harcourt's death moved through Rosehill as swiftly as the scent of fresh bread from the bakery. By noon, every cottage window seemed to be edged with a curious face, and in the snug bar of the Red Fox Inn, conversation turned to nothing else. Miss Marple, however, had not hurried to the vicarage. She believed in the usefulness of allowing people time to reveal themselves. Instead, she returned to her neat whitewashed cottage at the end of Church Lane. She placed her knitting on the oak table, filled the kettle, and allowed her mind to wander over what she had already observed. Thomas Blake's agitation, Mrs. Pym's trembling hands, the glimmer of blue in the teacup. Presently, there was a knock at her door. When she opened it, she found Inspector Henry Cray standing on the step. A broad-shouldered man with an expression that hovered between exasperation and respect. Cray had known Miss Marple long enough to suspect that her apparent fragility was a very clever disguise. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said. "I thought I'd best speak with you before the rumors get entirely out of hand." "Do come in, Inspector." She poured him tea and waited as he settled into the chintz-covered armchair. He stirred his cup but did not drink. "It's Harcourt, as you've no doubt heard," Cray began. "Found in his study at about 9:30 by his housekeeper. Looks as though he'd been having his breakfast, or part of it." The inspector hesitated, frowning. There was a cup of tea beside him, and something odd about it. A stone, or jewel of some kind, sitting right in the dregs. Miss Marple raised her brows. "A jewel, you say?" "That's how it looked," Cray said, scratching his temple. "Could be a piece of glass for all I know. But Harcourt was holding it when we found him, clutching the saucer as if he meant to keep it." Miss Marple set down her own cup. "And the cause of death?" "Too early to say." Cray's tone was guarded. "No sign of a struggle, but the doctor thinks it wasn't natural. We'll know more after the post-mortem." Miss Marple regarded him with polite concern. "Such a pity. Mr. Harcourt always seemed fastidious. One imagines he would be particular about how his tea was served." Cray gave a short laugh. "Trust you to notice that, Miss Marple." He stood, hat in hand. "I'd better get back before my sergeant makes a dog's dinner of the interviews." After the inspector left, Miss Marple sat quietly for a while, gazing out at the late summer roses nodding in her garden. She thought of the sapphire-colored gleam she had seen at the Bluebell tea room, and how very strange it was that 2 cups of tea, in 2 different places, should both hide something that did not belong. Chapter 3. The Gathering at the Vicarage. By late afternoon, the vicarage had become a place of low voices and restless footsteps. The September sun slanted through the mullioned windows, catching dust motes in the air, and the smell of beeswax polish mingled oddly with the faint tang of tea leaves still lingering in the study. Miss Marple arrived quietly, her sensible shoes making no sound on the flagstones. A uniformed constable at the door gave a respectful nod as she passed. Inside, Inspector Cray stood beside the desk, speaking with Mrs. Margaret Harcourt, Gerald's widow. She was a handsome woman, though the lines of worry about her mouth looked deeper than grief alone could carve. "You shouldn't be here, Miss Marple," Cray said, though without real conviction. "This isn't a social call." "I quite understand, Inspector," she replied mildly. "But Mrs. Harcourt and I have often worked together at the church fetes. Perhaps I might be of some comfort." Mrs. Harcourt gave a tremulous smile. "I'd be grateful, Miss Marple. It's all so dreadful. Gerald was perfectly well at breakfast." Her gaze strayed to the writing desk where her husband had been found. He'd said he was expecting a letter, something about an old purchase. He was secretive. Miss Marple inclined her head. "Sometimes gentlemen prefer to keep their little indulgences quiet," she said gently. "A coin, a book, or a jewel, perhaps." Mrs. Harcourt blinked. "A jewel? Whatever do you mean?" Before Miss Marple could elaborate, Cray returned with a thin ledger and a frown. "We've accounted for everyone who saw Harcourt this morning," he said. "There's his wife, naturally, the housekeeper, Mrs. Webb, and young Mr. Blake, who delivered groceries at 8:30. Any quarrels?" Miss Marple asked. Cray rubbed his chin. "Not exactly, though Mrs. Webb claims she overheard voices in here last night, raised voices. She couldn't tell who the other person was." "Was Mr. Harcourt known to have enemies?" Miss Marple's tone was almost apologetic. Mrs. Harcourt hesitated. "Not enemies, no. But there was a disagreement with Dr. Fenwick over the parish trust funds. And I suppose the vicar was annoyed when Gerald suggested selling a piece of church land." As the widow spoke, Miss Marple's eyes wandered around the room. There, on the carpet beside the desk, a single thread of deep blue caught the light. She bent to retrieve it, a short filament, finer than wool, glinting like the heart of a sapphire. "How curious," she murmured, slipping it discreetly into a handkerchief. Cray raised an eyebrow. "Find something?" "Only a trifle," she said, tucking the cloth away. "But in my experience, Inspector, trifles can be rather telling." Outside, the church bell tolled 4 times, its echoes drifting through the vicarage like a quiet warning. Miss Marple stood very still, sensing that the calm surface of Rosehill life had only just begun to crack. Chapter 4. Tea, whispers, and a locked drawer. The next morning dawned bright and deceptively peaceful over Rosehill. Swallows traced quick loops above the church tower. The scent of honeysuckle drifted through the air. Yet in the Bluebell tea room, conversation was brittle, each remark landing like a pebble on thin ice. Mrs. Pewem stood behind the counter, pouring tea with unusual stiffness. At a corner table, Mrs. Heatherstone leaned close to Miss Ellie Finch, her voice a conspiratorial murmur. "They say the inspector found a note on Mr. Harcourt's desk. Folded twice. No one knows what it said." Miss Finch, pink-cheeked with curiosity, whispered back, "And there's talk of a missing key. To his bureau, I believe. Mrs. Webb swore she locked the study herself last night." Miss Marple, knitting serenely nearby, allowed the talk to wash over her. She counted the stitches on her needles, but her attention was elsewhere, on the locked drawer mentioned in passing, on Mrs. Pewam's eyes flicking nervously to the teacup display, and on the curious absence of Thomas Blake, who was usually quick to hover around gossip. When at last Mrs. Pewam approached her table with a fresh pot, Miss Marple looked up kindly. "You seem a little troubled, Mrs. Pewam. May I help?" The tea-room owner pressed her lips together. "It's silly, I dare say. Only, Mr. Harcourt came in yesterday morning, just after opening. He ordered a pot of Darjeeling and asked if I'd polish one of the cups. Said it was for a friend, a collector, perhaps. But when he left, I found a tiny smear of blue on the saucer. Like the inside of a jewel." Miss Marple's expression barely changed, but she felt the small, steady click of another piece sliding into place. Meanwhile, at the vicarage, Inspector Cray was standing before the late Gerald Harcourt's bureau. The lock on the top drawer had been neatly forced. Inside lay a slim envelope, unsealed, containing a single sheet of paper. Cray frowned at the elegant handwriting. "The stone is not safe here. Meet me before the fete. Tell no one." No signature. Cray tucked the note into his pocket just as Mrs. Webb entered with a tray of sandwiches. "Will you be staying for luncheon, Inspector?" she asked, avoiding his eyes. "Not just now," he replied. "But keep the room secured, Mrs. Webb. I've an idea our late vicar's affairs were rather more complicated than they looked." At her cottage, Miss Marple set her knitting aside and reached for a neat envelope addressed in her spidery script to a former acquaintance at Scotland Yard. A discreet question, she thought, about blue sapphires recently reported missing from London jewellers. Rosehill might look the picture of tranquility, roses clambering over stone walls, bees humming lazily in the sun, but Jane Marple had lived long enough to know that where beauty lingered, so too could greed, pride, and desperation. Chapter 5. Suspects in Sunlight. Sunday in Rosehill brought a quiet warmth to the stone cottages. Children skipped along the lane to the churchyard, their laughter oddly at odds with the low murmur among the grown-ups who gathered at the gate before the morning service. Miss Marple arrived a little later than usual, pausing to exchange pleasantries with Mrs. Harcourt, who wore a dark coat that failed to hide the faint puffiness about her eyes. Inside, the vicar, a nervous young curate drafted in at short notice, stumbled over the prayers, his voice quivering as though the very pews were listening too hard. Afterwards, a cluster of villagers lingered in the sunlight near the Lychgate. Inspector Cray was there, hat pushed back, speaking to Dr. Fenwick, the parish physician, whose heavy brow and clipped replies gave the impression of a man unwilling to be questioned. Miss Ellie Finch stood nearby with Thomas Blake, who looked pale and distracted. Mrs. Pewham hovered on the edge of the group, twisting a napkin in her hands. Cray glanced at Miss Marple. "Good morning, I've begun putting names to our little puzzle." He ticked them off on his fingers. Mrs. Margaret Harcourt, the widow, calm on the surface, but clearly anxious. Mrs. Webb, the housekeeper, who admitted overhearing raised voices on the night before the death. Dr. Fenwick, in dispute with Harcourt about parish funds. Thomas Blake, last known caller that morning, and acting decidedly shifty. Mrs. Pewham, in whose tea-room the strange cup was first seen. Any one of them might have had a reason, Cray added, lowering his voice. And then there's that note about a stone not being safe. Miss Marple's eyes moved from face to face, noting a tremor in Mrs. Webb's hands, the way Mrs. Pewham avoided looking at the curate, and how Blake flinched whenever the word sapphire was mentioned. She said mildly, "It's remarkable, Inspector, how people betray themselves when they believe no one is paying attention." Cray sighed. "If you're about to tell me you've spotted something, Miss Marple, I suppose I'd better hear it." But she merely smiled. Only that a jewel, hidden in a teacup, is a rather desperate choice of hiding place. One wonders what sort of pressure might make someone act in such a hurry. The church bell began to toll again, scattering the group back to their homes. Miss Marple lingered a moment longer, looking thoughtfully toward the vicarage window where, behind a thin muslin curtain, an unknown watcher's silhouette stood perfectly still. Chapter 6. Threads in the afternoon. The afternoon settled hot and still over Rosehill, the kind of weather that coaxed people from their houses yet dulled their voices to murmurs. Miss Marple, neat as always in a pale summer hat, walked the short lane from her cottage to Mrs. Pewham's tea-room. She preferred to arrive early, when the tables were only half-filled and one could see who chose to sit where. Inside, the air smelled of lemon sponge and furniture polish. Mrs. Pewham greeted her with a smile that seemed to tremble at the edges. "Another pot of Earl Grey, Miss Marple?" "Yes, please. And perhaps you might sit with me, if you have a moment." Mrs. Pewham hesitated, then wiped her hands on her apron and joined her. Up close, she looked pale, the faint blue veins at her temples standing out against her skin. "I keep thinking of poor Mr. Harcourt," she said quietly. "He was so particular about things, especially that cup." "The one he asked you to polish?" Mrs. Pewham nodded. "Said it had belonged to a great-aunt. But after he left, I saw him talking to Dr. Fenwick just by the post office. Looked as if they were quarrelling." Miss Marple stored that away with a small inclination of her head. She was about to ask another question when Thomas Blake slipped through the doorway, brushing crumbs from his sleeve. He glanced about, saw them watching, and coloured. "Miss Marple," he said hurriedly, "Inspector Cray wants you at the vicarage. They've discovered something in Harcourt's bureau." A short walk later, she found Cray standing over the open drawer. Spread across the polished wood lay several envelopes, each marked in Harcourt's tidy script. One contained a folded receipt from a London jeweller for one unmounted sapphire, of excellent clarity. Another, more curious, was a letter written in a woman's hand. "If you mean to keep the stone, you must also keep your word. I will not be left to answer alone." Cray tapped the paper. No signature, no date. But it seems our Mr. Harcourt was mixed up in something rather bigger than parish land. Miss Marple peered at the looping handwriting. A lady, I should think, steady penmanship, yet the pressure here suggests annoyance. She traced the faint score marks where the nib had bitten into the paper. Whoever she is, she meant every syllable. Outside, the curate's bell rang for evening prayers. From the window, Miss Marple watched villagers drifting toward the church path, Mrs. Harcourt moving with careful composure, Dr. Fenwick walking fast, eyes down, and Thomas Blake hovering behind, torn between fear and some private resolve. Rosehill looked golden in the lowering sun, but Jane Marple felt the weight of a shadow threading through its quiet lanes, a shadow drawn tighter with every clue. Chapter 7. Cracks in the calm. By Monday morning Rosehill had recovered a surface calm, though only the unwary could mistake it for peace. Windows stood open to let out the heat, but curtains twitched at every passing step. Miss Marple made her way to the vicarage just after 10, where Inspector Cray was interviewing Mrs. Webb in the small sitting room. The housekeeper sat stiff-backed, twisting her apron into a tight rope. "I've told you all I know, sir," she said, voice sharp with nerves. "I laid the vicar's breakfast at 8:30 and went to hang the laundry. When I returned, he was gone, and then I heard Mr. Blake calling from the study." Cray leaned against the mantel, noting every word. "And the raised voices you mentioned." Mrs. Webb pursed her lips. "That was the night before. I'd gone to fetch a broom and heard Mr. Harcourt talking with someone. I couldn't hear it all, just stone, and dangerous. I thought it best not to pry." After she had gone, Cray gave Miss Marple a wry look. "If we're not careful, the whole village will have handled this sapphire." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Not necessarily, Inspector. But stones, whether precious or otherwise, have a way of drawing out the worst in people." Later, walking back through the sunlit churchyard, she encountered Dr. Fenwick. He stood among the headstones, gazing toward the lane where Mrs. Harcourt's carriage had just disappeared. "Hot weather for funerals," he said without preamble. Miss Marple regarded him with quiet interest. "Do you expect another so soon, Doctor?" He gave a start, then laughed awkwardly. "Good heavens, no. Only a figure of speech." But when he moved off, his stride was too quick, his shoulders too stiff. That evening, at her cottage, Miss Marple set aside her knitting and reviewed her notes. Harcourt possessed a sapphire purchased in London. Someone, a woman, warned him to keep his word. A teacup at the Bluebell held a sapphire-coloured smear. Raised voices, a locked drawer, and a stone described as not safe here. Outside, dusk fell over Rosehill, blurring the cottages into soft silhouettes. Somewhere a nightjar called, lonely and persistent. Miss Marple folded her paper neatly. The village was drawing its curtains, but she knew that shadows were often clearest once the lamps had been lit. Chapter 8. Evening at the Red Fox. By the time the sun slid behind the hedgerows, the Red Fox Inn was humming with cautious talk. The low-ceilinged room smelled of hops and polished oak. Tankards clinked while voices dipped each time the door creaked. Miss Marple had chosen a discreet corner near the settle, knitting in her lap more as camouflage than pastime. From there she could see nearly everyone. Dr. Fenwick at the bar, his eyes fixed on the froth of his pint, Mrs. Webb at a table with the curate, speaking in undertones, Thomas Blake slipping in late, gaze darting toward the window, and Mrs. Pume, who sat rigidly on a stool, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles gleamed white. Inspector Cray arrived last, brushing rain from his coat. He nodded at Miss Marple before planting himself squarely in the center of the room. "Evening, all. I'd like a quiet word with each of you, but we'll start informally." A tense silence followed, broken only by the snap of the inn's fire. Cray continued, "Mr. Harcourt's death isn't the simple business some hoped. We've learned he was in possession of a valuable sapphire, bought recently in London. That stone's missing. Whoever has knowledge of it would be wise to speak now." No one answered. Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. "Curious, isn't it, how a single object can unbalance an entire room?" she said lightly. Mrs. Pym gave a strangled little laugh. "I don't know anything about jewels," she protested. Thomas Blake shifted in his chair. "Maybe he sold it on," he suggested, voice too loud. Dr. Fenwick put down his glass with a sharp clink. "Speculation won't help," he said curtly. Cray's gaze moved slowly from one face to another. "Until the stone is found," he warned, "everyone here remains part of this investigation." Outside, the rain thickened to a steady patter, drumming against the window panes. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, but her eyes were far away. She could feel the knot of motives tightening: fear, resentment, greed, all circling something blue that gleamed just out of sight. Chapter 9. A Clue in the Rain. The next morning dawned grey and heavy, rain pressing against the windows of Rosehill like a restless hand. Miss Marple stood at her kitchen table, arranging a small posy of late roses when a knock came at the door. Inspector Cray stood there, collar turned up against the drizzle. "Morning, Miss Marple. Thought you'd want to see this." He produced a damp envelope. Inside was a single slip of paper, creased and stained where the rain had soaked through. "The cup was never meant to be used. Hide it before it ruins us both." Miss Marple read the words twice, then set the note on her dresser. "Where was this found?" "In the church porch," Cray replied. Young Blake spotted it under the mat. "Ah." She studied the handwriting, the same feminine hand as the letter from Harcourt's drawer, though the ink here looked hurried, the loops jagged. "A warning written in haste," she murmured. Cray looked grim. "We've checked Harcourt's things again. The stone's still missing, and now someone's trying to cover their tracks." Miss Marple fetched her umbrella. "Perhaps we should walk to the tea room," she said. "Rain has a way of loosening tongues." The bluebell was half empty, the windows fogged from the damp. Mrs. Pym glanced up as they entered, a quick flicker of apprehension in her eyes. "Morning, Mrs. Pym," Cray said easily. "We're looking for a cup, delicate porcelain, faint blue mark on the saucer. Recognize it?" Mrs. Pym's fingers tightened on the teapot she was polishing. I've so many cups, Inspector. Couldn't say." Miss Marple watched her calmly. "I remember, dear, you once kept your favorite pieces locked in that cabinet behind the counter. Might it still be there?" For a moment, Mrs. Pym seemed not to breathe. Then she turned, fetched a small brass key from her pocket, and opened the glass-fronted cabinet. On the top shelf sat a single cup and saucer, white with a thin band of gold. And just visible at the bottom, beneath the curve of china, was a tiny shimmer of blue. Miss Marple leaned closer. "How very pretty," she said softly. "One wonders why such a cup should cause so much unease." Chapter 10. The Cup on the Table. Inspector Cray set the cup carefully on Mrs. Pym's counter, its gold rim gleaming even in the dim light. Rain trickled down the window behind them, drumming a steady rhythm against the glass. "Pretty little thing," he said. "But if this is where Harcourt's jewel was hidden, it's more than crockery now." Mrs. Pym wrung her apron. "I didn't steal anything, Inspector. He left it with me, said he'd be back after luncheon. I thought nothing of it, until I heard about the vicarage." Cray's gaze narrowed. "You didn't think to mention it sooner." "I was frightened." Her voice trembled. "Mr. Harcourt was kind, but there was urgency that morning. He told me not to let anyone else handle it." Miss Marple examined the saucer. A faint line of dried tea clung to the curve, and, caught in its residue, a grain of something that winked blue in the lamplight. She produced a clean handkerchief and lifted the particle with her knitting needle. "Hardly the size one expects for a sapphire," she remarked. "But perhaps a chip, or dust from a stone recently cut." Cray nodded. "Could confirm it with a jeweler." He turned back to Mrs. Pym. "Anyone see you take this out of the cabinet?" Mrs. Pym shook her head. "Only Thomas Blake came in early, asking if I needed help with deliveries. He looked pale, as if he'd been out all night." Miss Marple tucked the fragment into a small envelope. "A stone seldom travels alone," she murmured. "If this is truly part of a larger gem, it must have been broken, or divided." Cray looked at her. You're thinking there might be 2 sapphires. Or one that's been cleverly disguised, Miss Marple replied. But either way, it means someone risked far more than tea and gossip. Outside, the rain eased to a mist. Miss Marple glanced through the window at the cobbled street, where Thomas Blake stood half hidden by the inn signpost, watching the tea room with an expression caught somewhere between guilt and fear. Chapter 11. Questions by Lamplight. That evening, a faint breeze chased away the lingering rain, leaving Rosehill scented with wet earth and late roses. Miss Marple sat by the window of her cottage, the lamplight soft on her knitting, when a knock sounded at the door. Inspector Cray stood there, hat in hand. Evening, Miss Marple. Mind if I come in? I've a few threads I can't quite tie. She ushered him to the fireside, poured tea, and waited. Cray spread several items on the table, the jeweller's receipt, the unsigned letters, and the scrap of blue grit from the teacup. Harcourt buys an unmounted sapphire, he began. Receives a warning from a lady. Hides the stone, possibly here. He gestured at the fragment. Then ends up dead, and the stone disappears. Miss Marple studied the pieces as though arranging a patchwork. Perhaps Mr. Harcourt had reason to keep the jewel separate from its setting, she said. A gem out of a mount is easy to hide, and to steal. Cray nodded. We've searched his bureau again. There's a hollow in the lining of the bottom drawer, big enough for a stone the size of a walnut. Empty, of course. Miss Marple took up her teacup, her eyes thoughtful. Tell me, Inspector, did Mr. Blake explain why he loitered near the tea room this morning? Cray snorted. Said he was worried for Mrs. Pume. Claimed he thought she might be accused of theft. An anxious young man, Miss Marple mused. Yet his anxiety seems oddly selective. Cray leaned forward. Are you hinting Blake might have found the sapphire? I hint nothing, she replied mildly, but I observe that guilt and fear often look very much alike. She set her cup down and regarded the inspector with calm, clear eyes. We must also consider Mrs. Harcourt. She has not spoken freely of her husband's dealings, nor of who else might have known about the purchase. Cray sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. You make it sound as if half the parish had reason to get their hands on that stone. Not half, said Miss Marple. Merely those with the wit to recognize its worth, and the desperation to risk everything for it. Outside, the moon edged from behind a drifting cloud, bathing the lane in pale light. Somewhere a dog barked, sharp and lonely. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap, feeling the story around her tighten, like knitting approaching its final rose. Chapter 12. Breakfast with Shadows. The next morning broke clear and cool, the first proper sunshine Rosehill had seen since Gerald Harcourt's death. Miss Marple enjoyed her porridge while the village stirred awake beyond her garden wall. A postman's whistle floated up the lane, followed by the faint clop of a milk cart. Just as she was rinsing her bowl, a timid knock came at the door. Thomas Blake stood on the step, cap in hand, cheeks pale beneath a night stubble. Miss Marple, might I come in? Of course, Thomas. She ushered him to a chair and set a fresh pot of tea on the hob. He perched on the edge, fingers worrying the brim of his cap. It's the sapphire, miss, he blurted. I didn't take it, I swear. But Mr. Harcourt asked me to keep an eye on something for him, a parcel from London. He said it was important, that I wasn't to speak of it. Miss Marple stirred the pot, letting the silence stretch just enough for him to fill it. He gave me a small wooden box, Blake continued. Said it held a stone, but I wasn't to open it. I hid it under the loose floorboard in my room. When I went to fetch it after that morning, it was gone. Miss Marple's brows lifted slightly. Who knew you kept rooms above the grocer's shop? No one. At least I thought so. But the latch on the window was off when I came home yesterday. Before she could ask more, a brisk rap sounded at the door. Mrs. Webb entered, flushed from hurrying. Beg pardon, Miss Marple, but the inspector sent me. He's found something else at the vicarage, behind a skirting board in the study. Within the hour, they stood once more in Gerald Harcourt's gloomy study. Cray pointed to a small recess newly pried open. Inside lay a folded scrap of paper and a slender silver spoon, its bowl stained faintly with a blue smear. Odd place to keep cutlery, Cray muttered. Miss Marple examined the spoon thoughtfully. Not so odd, Inspector. A spoon is an excellent way to scoop something from a cup without drawing notice, or to stir a powder one means to conceal. Cray frowned. You think someone tampered with his tea? I think, said Miss Marple, that our jewel may not be the only dangerous thing that changed hands in this room. Chapter 13. A Whisper in the Belfry. By the time the church bell tolled noon, Rosehill's sky had turned a washed-out silver, promising another downpour before evening. Miss Marple made her way across the green toward the church, a small notebook tucked beneath her shawl. Inside, she found the curate arranging hymnals. He started when he saw her. Miss Marple. I didn't expect visitors. I thought I'd look in on the belfry, she said mildly. Such an old tower always rewards a curious eye. Together they climbed the narrow spiral steps. Dust motes floated in the slanting light from the lancet windows. The faint smell of pigeons mingled with old stone. Halfway up, something glimmered between two beams. Miss Marple paused, stooping to pick up a scrap of folded cloth, fine linen, with a faint smear of deep blue. She tucked it into her pocket just as a voice floated up from below. Miss Marple. Are you all right? Inspector Cray's tone carried a note of caution. All quite well, she called, descending. She showed him the cloth. It seems someone thought this a convenient hiding place. Cray's jaw tightened. That's the third trace of blue we found, the teacup, the spoon, now this. Indeed. Miss Marple looked past him toward the nave, where Mrs. Harcourt had just entered, her face pale but composed. She knelt briefly in a pew, eyes downcast. When she rose, Miss Marple saw the faintest tremor in her hands as she adjusted her veil, and something small gleamed in her palm before it vanished back into the folds of her glove. Later, as they stepped outside into soft rain, Cray said quietly, Do you think the widow knows more than she's saying? Miss Marple closed her notebook. I think, Inspector, that Mrs. Harcourt has been carrying a burden heavier than grief, and I think we are getting very close to the heart of this matter. A gust of wind stirred the trees, scattering droplets across the grass. From the belfry above, a pigeon fluttered out, its wings catching the dim light like a warning. Chapter 14. An Evening Call. Twilight settled gently over Rosehill, tinting the thatched roofs a soft lavender. Lamps flickered on behind cottage curtains, and a faint mist gathered in the hollows of the green. Miss Marple, shawl tucked neatly about her shoulders, crossed the lane to the vicarage in answer to a note left at her door by Inspector Cray. Inside, the study smelled faintly of beeswax and rain-damp wood. Cray stood near the desk, a constable beside him holding an evidence pouch. We've something new, Cray said. Sergeant found this tucked behind the clock on the mantel. The pouch held a thin slip of paper, folded so often it was soft at the edges. Cray smoothed it open on the desk. The stone is yours if you keep silence. Otherwise, it will destroy us both. Miss Marple bent over the note. The writing was the same steady hand as before, but the strokes pressed deep into the paper, as though written under strain. Someone's bargaining for more than money, she said quietly. Cray nodded. Could be Harcourt himself, or the woman who wrote the other letter. Either way, this was hidden deliberately. He glanced toward the window where the dusklight was fading. I'm beginning to wonder if the motive wasn't theft at all, perhaps something worth more than a jewel. Miss Marple looked thoughtful. Love, fear, pride. They often cost far dearer than sapphires, Inspector. Those sapphires have a way of drawing them out. At that moment the door opened and Mrs. Harcourt stepped in, carrying a tray of tea. Her composure was perfect, but her eyes flicked toward the unfolded note. You found another message? She asked, voice steady but a shade too casual. Cray gestured for her to sit. Mrs. Harcourt, can you think of anyone who might have written this? She lowered herself onto the sofa, hands clasped tight around her cup. No, she said softly. Gerald never confided in me about whatever this is. Miss Marple watched her carefully. A single drop of tea trembled on the rim of the cup before falling, dark against the saucer. Outside, the mist thickened, blurring the garden into shadows. Miss Marple felt that the village, so small, so orderly, was beginning to reveal the dangerous current running beneath its calm surface. Chapter 15. Threads at the Hearth. The next afternoon brought a brisk wind and a sky the color of pewter. Miss Marple, after a thoughtful morning with her knitting, invited Inspector Cray for tea. The little parlour was warm with the scent of scones, the ticking of the mantel clock steady as a heartbeat. Cray arrived with his notebook bulging from overuse. He perched on the edge of the armchair, casting a wary glance at the cat curled by the fire. "I can't shake the feeling," he began, "that every time we find one answer, it leads to 3 more questions." "That is the nature of puzzles," Miss Marple replied, buttering a scone. "But there comes a point when threads begin to form a pattern, if one is patient." She drew a folded paper from beneath her knitting bag. Upon it she had written a neat list. Mrs. Harcourt, grief-stricken, but concealing something. Possible knowledge of the Sapphire's whereabouts. Thomas Blake, young, impressionable, entrusted with a mysterious parcel, now missing. Mrs. P.W.M., T. Rumona, anxious about gossip, oddly protective of certain customers. Mr. Ellison, jeweller in Elmsworth, last to handle the stone. Curate Holloway, keeps the church keys, often alone in the tower. Unknown lady, author of letters, bargaining for silence. Cray peered at the page. "You make it sound so tidy, but I can't yet see who had both chance and courage to poison a man in daylight." Miss Marple sipped her tea, eyes distant. "Poison, Inspector, is not a weapon for the rash. It belongs to those who fear a scene, or who trust that no one will look too closely." Cray leaned forward. "Do you mean the tea itself was laced?" "Not necessarily." She glanced toward the blue-stained spoon on the sideboard. "Something was introduced, yes, but not necessarily for the purpose we assume." Before he could press further, the doorbell chimed. Mrs. P.W.M. bustled in, cheeks pink from the wind. "Beg pardon, Miss Marple," she said breathlessly, "but I thought you should know, there's been a break-in at the jeweller's in Elmsworth, and the only thing taken was a single sapphire, unset, about the size of a walnut." Miss Marple set her cup down very carefully. "How interesting," she murmured. Outside, the wind rattled the holly leaves against the windowpane. Something in the rhythm sounded to her like a warning. The thief, the stone, and the killer were moving closer, and time was running short. Chapter 16. Footsteps at the crossroads. A restless wind combed the hedgerows as Miss Marple walked toward the crossroads at the edge of Rosehill. Evening was sliding in. A slant of pale sun lit the road while long shadows reached from the hedges like fingers. She had arranged to meet Inspector Cray there, after his hurried message about the theft in Elmsworth. Cray was waiting by the milestone, coat collar turned up against the breeze. "Someone knew exactly what to take," he said without preamble. "The jeweler swears the stone stolen last night matches the one Harcourt bought. Clean job, no fingerprints, no sign of forcing." Miss Marple's eyes travelled along the quiet lanes, noting the worn track that veered toward the churchyard. "Our thief has nerve," she said, "and probably a comfortable knowledge of the villagers' habits." They walked slowly toward the Elwich gate, where the gravel was scuffed as though by hurried feet. Cray crouched, frowning at a faint impression in the soft earth. Small boot, narrow heel. Woman's shoe. "Or a youth's," Miss Marple said. "Perhaps one already in possession of the stone, moving it on, or hiding it until the storm passes." Cray straightened. "You're thinking of Blake again." "Not only of him." Her eyes softened. "Thomas may be impetuous, but he is not sly. Someone used him, I think, as a convenient hiding place." As they spoke, a figure approached along the lane. Mrs. Harcourt, cloak pulled close, a parcel clutched in her hand. She started at the sight of them. "Miss Marple." "Inspector. I didn't expect anyone here." "Evening, madam," Cray said, polite but watchful. "Taking a walk?" She hesitated, then forced a smile. "Yes, I needed air. The house feels so heavy." Miss Marple's gaze slipped to the parcel. The paper was creased, damp at the corners, as if handled in haste. "May I carry that for you, my dear? The wind is fierce." Mrs. Harcourt drew the parcel nearer. "Thank you, but I'm quite able." When she had gone, Cray exhaled. "She's hiding something, isn't she?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple said softly, "but not, I think, out of malice. Fear, rather, or guilt. The question is, whose guilt?" They stood for a moment, the wind fluttering the inspector's notes. From the churchyard came the faint toll of the evening bell, steady and low, as if marking the time left before the truth could no longer be contained. Chapter 17. Secrets by Candlelight. Rain swept in again after dusk, pattering against Miss Marple's windows while a single candle burned steadily on her writing desk. She had barely settled with her knitting when a timid knock sounded. Thomas Blake stood there, hat dripping, his face pale in the glow from the hall. "Miss Marple, may I come in? I think I've remembered something." She led him to the fire and poured a measure of tea. He cradled the cup as if for warmth more than thirst. "It was the day before Mr. Harcourt died," he said slowly. "I saw Mrs. Harcourt slip a note through the jeweller's post slot, late, near closing. She looked round first, like she didn't want anyone to see." Miss Marple's needles clicked once, twice, before she set them aside. "A note. Did you see its contents?" Blake shook his head. "Only that she was in a hurry. Afterward she went straight to the tea room, sat with Mrs. P.M. They talked low, like they didn't want me hearing." Outside, a shutter banged against its hinge. Miss Marple rose to fasten it, her eyes thoughtful. "Thomas," she said gently, "did you ever mention the hiding place under your floorboard to anyone?" "No. Only Mr. Harcourt knew." He hesitated, shame clouding his young face. Unless someone might have heard him telling me. That evening at the inn, he'd had more wine than usual." Miss Marple's glance softened. "You've been very brave, my dear. But there is one more question." She reached for a folded scrap lying near the candle, the bargain note found behind the clock. "Does this handwriting remind you of anyone?" Blake bent close, frowning at the dark ink. A flicker of recognition crossed his features. It's like Mrs. P.M.'s, only tighter. She writes the tea room menu in the same loops." Miss Marple nodded slightly, as if a stitch had just fallen into place. When Thomas had gone, she sat for a while in the warm hush, the candle throwing soft gold across her neat rows of knitting. Outside, rain whispered against the eaves, steady, insistent, like someone tapping to be let in with a secret at last ready to be told. Chapter 18. Storm over Rosehill. A low, heavy sky hung above Rosehill as evening closed in. Clouds massed like grey wool, and the air smelled of wet stone and wood smoke. Miss Marple stepped carefully along the slick cobbles toward the tea room, where a warm glow showed through the windows. Inside, only Mrs. P.Y.M. remained, wiping down the tables before closing. "Ah, Miss Marple," she said, forcing a smile. "The weather's dreadful, isn't it?" "Quite," Miss Marple replied, settling at a corner table. "But I thought a pot of tea might lighten the gloom." As Mrs. P.Y.M. busied herself, Miss Marple's sharp eyes took in every detail. The tidy rows of teacups, the framed menu written in Mrs. P.Y.M.'s rounded hand, loops and flourishes strikingly like the writing on the threatening note. When the tea was poured, Miss Marple spoke gently. "You and Gerald Harcourt were friends of long standing, were you not?" Mrs. P.Y.M. froze, teapot in midair. I suppose you could say so. He sometimes came here for advice." "Advice about a sapphire?" Colour drained from the woman's cheeks. She set the pot down with a clink. "I never wanted any of this," she whispered. "I only meant to protect him, and myself." She broke off, eyes darting toward the door as a shadow passed outside on the rain-blurred glass. Miss Marple caught the movement too, tall, brisk, carrying an umbrella. Inspector Cray entered, rainwater glistening on his coat. "Evening, ladies." He glanced between them, reading the tension. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all," Miss Marple said mildly. "In fact, you may have arrived at a most opportune moment." Mrs. P.W. sank into a chair, hands trembling. "I tried to warn him," she said. "I begged him not to keep it in the house. He thought he was clever, hiding it in a cup, then in that boy's room. But someone else was listening." "Who?" Cray asked sharply. Before she could answer, a gust rattled the door, and the bell above it jingled hard, but no one entered. A chill settled in the little shop, as if the storm outside had slipped in with the wind. Miss Marple folded her hands. "Perhaps," she said softly, "the person who wanted that stone most dearly has just realized how close we are." Chapter 19. The net tightens. Rain lashed Rosehill through the night, drumming on slates and rattling shutters. At the vicarage, Inspector Cray paced before the hearth while Miss Marple sat composed in the opposite chair, her knitting bag at her feet. "Mrs. Perm swears she warned Harcourt," Cray said. "Says she only wrote that note to frighten him into caution. But she denies slipping poison into his tea." Miss Marple's needles moved, steady as heartbeat. And yet she knew about the stone, knew where it might be hidden. That is more than most. Cray sighed. Then there's the widow, parcel under her arm, walking alone at the crossroads. She claims it was just old letters. Letters can be dangerous, Inspector, Miss Marple said quietly, especially if they speak of a past someone wishes to forget. Cray dropped into a chair. We're close, but I can't see the whole picture. Miss Marple regarded the fire. Sometimes, when a picture is blurred, one must invite the artist to finish it. He looked up sharply. You mean? A gathering, she said. At Mrs. Pym's tea room. Everyone who has a piece of this puzzle, Mrs. Harcourt, Thomas Blake, Mrs. Pym herself, and perhaps the curate, who has access to every quiet corner of the church. Cray nodded slowly, understanding dawning. You want to see how they behave when all the pieces sit together on the table. Exactly, said Miss Marple, winding her wool. And perhaps, with luck, the guilty hand will betray itself. Outside, the storm slackened to a steady drizzle. Beyond the window, the lane gleamed like dark glass, reflecting the wavering light of the fire. Miss Marple rose, straightening her shawl. Tomorrow afternoon, Inspector. Let us set the stage, and see whose conscience cannot bear the play. Chapter 20. Tea with Shadows. By mid-afternoon the clouds had thinned, though puddles still mirrored the pale sky. Mrs. Pym's tea room smelled of drying scones and rain-damp wool as Miss Marple arrived with Inspector Cray. The little tables had been pushed together, making one long board set with cups and a single polished pot of tea. One by one the others appeared. Mrs. Harcourt came first, veiled but composed, a small parcel clutched in her gloved hands. Thomas Blake followed, pale and nervous, eyes darting toward the door. Last was Curate Holloway, raincoat dripping, his expression unreadable. Miss Marple poured tea with serene precision. We meet, she said, because a man is dead, and the truth has been scattered like crumbs. It is time to gather them. Cray took up the thread, reviewing what they knew, Harcourt's purchase of the Sapphire, the anonymous letters, the spoon smeared with blue, the jewel stolen from Elmsworth. As he spoke, Miss Marple quietly studied the faces around the table. When Cray mentioned the hidden floorboard, Blake shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Harcourt's fingers tightened on her parcel. Holloway, however, sat very still, gaze fixed on the steam rising from his cup. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. There is something each of you holds back. Mr. Blake, you feared being blamed for theft. Mrs. Harcourt, you have tried to protect your late husband's memory. And you, Mr. Holloway. She let the words hang. You seem curiously calm for one who discovered the first trace of that blue grit. The curate's eyes flickered, just once, before settling again. Mrs. Pym, standing behind the counter, cleared her throat. Perhaps, she said nervously, someone ought to tell Miss Marple where the sapphire truly is. No one spoke. The only sound was the slow tick of the wall clock and the rainwater dripping from Holloway's coat onto the polished floor. Miss Marple folded her hands on the table. Very well, she said softly. I believe I shall have to show you where to look.